Estoy muy contento y honrado porque tenemos, este hombre es uno de los héroes de la fe en el mundo. La verdad que es un honor, estoy aquí, me está acompañando Ana, me está acompañando Raúl y voy a meter en escena en este momento, adivinen a quién, al señor William Lane Craig. Así que quiero darle la bienvenida. Dr. Craig, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Vamos a aprovechar que el doctor está aquí y voy con 10 preguntas que ustedes mismos hicieron en las publicaciones, en los comentarios. Así que estas son sus preguntas y espero que puedan disfrutar unas valiosas respuestas y que llenen su corazón. La primera pregunta, para quienes quizás no están familiarizados con su trabajo, doctor Craig, ¿podría compartirnos qué le motivó a dedicarse a la apologética y cómo usted ha visto el impacto en el mundo cristiano?
Well, I didn't become a Christian believer until I was in the final 2 years of high school. And so all of my family, all of my friends were non Christians when I made this decision to follow Christ. And so I was immediately put into the position of needing to explain to them why I had taken this step. And so, right from the beginning, I was involved in giving reasons for faith. And when I graduated from high school and went away to college, that interest was deepened. And I had the vision of sharing the gospel with people in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the faith. And so it was there that this idea for an apologetics ministry was birthed.
Creo que una de las cosas que también pasa en Latinoamérica es que nosotros desconocemos que hay un mundo intelectual, que hay una necesidad, y creo que es por el contexto latinoamericano. Una segunda pregunta, doctor Cray, es, sabemos que la fe cristiana tiene una larga tradición intelectual y académica, pero muchos cristianos no siempre conocen esta dimensión. ¿Qué relevancia cree usted que tiene hoy para los cristianos contar con una fe intelectualmente defendible?
I think it's vitally important that Christians be intellectually informed to know what they believe and why they believe it. And I say that for three reasons. First of all, I think that it's vital to being salt and light in our contemporary culture, as Jesus commanded. Even though Latin America has a strong Catholic background, still the inroads of European secularism, I think, are everywhere, especially in the university system. And if we are to be able to commend our faith in our culture, we need to be able to shape the culture in such a way that believing in Jesus Christ is not like believing in Santa Claus or leprechauns. We need to help people to understand that Christian faith is a rational option for thinking men and women today. And then, secondly, I would say that if we do not engage in this kind of intellectual pursuit, we are in real danger of losing our youth. In high school and university, Christian young people are bombarded with every type of ism and philosophy conjoined with an overwhelming relativism. And so many of the youth are deconstructing their faith and walking away from Christianity. And it's vital, if we're to preserve the Christian faith for the next generation, that we be able to give good reasons for why we think Christian faith is true. And then finally, I would say that apologetics is useful in evangelism. When you share the gospel with people today, they will typically have objections or questions, or they will ask you to prove to them that what you believe is true. And if we cannot do that, then Christianity and our witness is just intellectually vacuous. They think that we're just emotionally motivated people with no good reasons to believe as we do. And so evangelism will be far more effective if we are prepared, as St. Peter said, to give an answer to everyone who asks us for the hope that is in us.
Voy a cambiar de tema radicalmente y voy a empezar por
It's
la
gonna change
raíz.
the topic.
Génesis 1 al 11. ¿Qué tipo de literatura es?
So
¿Literal?
what
¿Mito historia? ¿Cómo la puedo abordar?
Now, before I answer that question, let me give a little bit of background. The Bible is composed of many different types of literature. And the type to which a piece of literature belongs is called its literary genre. So, in the Bible, you have many different literary genres represented. For example, the Psalms are poetry. The Gospels are biographies. The letters of
Ujú.
Paul are epistolary literature. The book of Acts is history. The book of Revelation is Jewish apocalyptic literature. And these different genres of literature need to be interpreted in a way that is appropriate to that genre. So, for example, while you could read the book of Acts literally as a historical document, it would be a profound mistake to read the book of Revelation in that way, because Jewish apocalyptic literature is filled with symbols. And so in the book of Revelation, these beasts and monsters that try to take over the earth are not to be taken literally. These are symbols for nations and alliances of nations. Similarly, when you read poetry like the Psalms, it would be a huge mistake to interpret these literally. If you do that, then God is a fire breathing monster who rides on the clouds like a chariot. These are clearly literary figures of speech. So you have to interpret each genre in a way that is appropriate to that type of literature. Now, that's by way of background. When we come to Genesis 1 to 11, the question is, what genre of literature does this represent? And Old Testament scholars are almost unanimous in saying that Genesis 1 to 11 stands apart as very different literature from Genesis 12 to 50, which is the story of the call of Abraham and the lives of the patriarchs. Those are historical narratives. But Genesis 1 to 11 bears a close resemblance to ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian myths. And this suggests that these narratives of Genesis 1 to 11 belong to a quasi mythical genre of literature. Now, I have to hasten to add that when these classicists use the word myth, they're not using it in the modern popular sense of a falsehood, like when we speak of the myth of the low calorie diet or something of that sort. Rather, they are using the word in the sense that folklorists use it. And the way folklorists use the word myth is to describe traditional sacred narratives that are handed down in a culture that seek to ground the institutions and values of that culture in events in the deep primordial past. And this is exactly what Genesis 1 to 11 tries to do. It tries to ground Jewish culture and values in these primordial events, and therefore has a quasi-mythical function for the nation of Israel. Now, at the same time, however, these primeval narratives are not simply an unordered pool of stories. Rather, they are connected by genealogies that form a sort of backbone to the chapters 1 to 11, and which supplies them with a chronological ordering. And finally, these genealogies meld seamlessly into the patriarchal narratives, where people like Abraham and Isaac and so forth are indisputably regarded as historical persons. And so what this suggests is that this is a type of literature that combines both history and myth. It seeks to describe real people and events that actually lived and happened, but it does so in the figurative language of myth. And therefore, it would be a mistake to press it for literal precision. This type of literature has been classified as mytho-historical. It is historical in that it's about real people and things, but it is in the figurative and metaphorical language of myth. And so that is how I would characterize the first 11 chapters of Genesis.
Esto podría poner nerviosos a muchos que nos escuchan porque la mayoría de nosotros hemos escuchado por mucho tiempo que hay una manera de interpretar Génesis de manera fiel y si no lo haces, estás básicamente negando completamente la autoridad y la inerrancia de la Biblia. ¿Cuáles serían sus palabras de ánimo para esas personas que han crecido escuchando eso, pero quieren explorar las otras posturas interpretativas de estos capítulos?
Yes, I would say that these folks, though sincere, are insufficiently informed about the different genres of literature that the Bible contains and how to interpret them properly. We mustn't think that only literature which is to be interpreted literally can be inspired. If you think that, you've got to throw the Psalms out of the Bible as uninspired. You've got to ditch the book of Revelation as uninspired. The fact is that there can be inspired, non-literal literature. And so, given that that's possible, really the only question is, what kind of literature is Genesis 1 to 11? And in my published work, I try to show that there are around 9 or 10 family resemblances of myth, and almost all of these are exhibited by Genesis 1 to 11. So that I think there's a very strong case to be made that God has elected to use this genre of literature, and it is inspired. It is inspired by God, but we shouldn't misinterpret it by thinking that it's meant to be a literal narrative of what happened.
Otra de las cosas que he encontrado yo personalmente, que he estado trabajando con con las publicaciones del Dr. Craig y algo, es que la audiencia le causa mucho ruido o mucho problema escuchar ese término mito o mito historia. Entonces, quisiera ver que el Dr. Craig nos pudiera explicar qué otros términos se han usado en la literatura académica para hablar de mito, o en lugar de mito historia, qué otros términos otros académicos usan para evitar estas connotaciones y por qué él escogió usar este término tan controversial que es mito historia.
You are quite right that the view that I'm advocating is not unusual, but I think is actually typical of evangelical Old Testament scholars, especially those who write commentaries on the book of Genesis. So, for example, Gordon Wenham uses the term proto-history. John Walton uses the word imagistic history. J.I. Packer uses the term dramatic history. John Collins calls it worldview history. Tremper Longman calls it theological history. All of these commentators are getting at the same point, that this is not straightforward historical writing, but it is imbued with a different kind of literature that means it shouldn't be interpreted literally and with a kind of wooden literality. Now, why do I prefer the more, shall we say, explosive and perhaps misunderstood term mytho-history? The reason is because I feel that I owe it to my Christian brethren to be straightforward with them, not to mince words, not to mislead them with pious euphemisms, but to give it to them straight. And mythohistory is the term that Assyriologists themselves use for this kind of literature. It was the great Assyriologist Thorkild Jakobsen who coined this phrase mythohistory to describe this type of literature. And I first heard the label used by Bill Arnold, who is a professor of Old Testament studies at Asbury Seminary. And I thought this captures exactly the essence of this kind of literature much more honestly and in line with contemporary scholarship, rather than these more evasive terms like proto-history and worldview history and things of that sort. So that's why I've chosen to use the standard terminology. Now, I recognize that in doing an interview like this, people who have never encountered this before are apt to be shocked and maybe even scandalized. But they need to understand that I've written a whole book on this subject, which is available in Spanish, called In Quest of the Historical Atom, where I go into enormous detail in analyzing the text of Genesis 1 to 11, and these family resemblances that are exhibited by myths, and argue that we have here a kind of blend of myth and history, that it is most appropriately labeled mytho-history.
Voy a preguntar como un usuario común, un estudiante llano de teología en Latinoamérica. Entonces, Adán y Eva y la serpiente, ¿era una serpiente real? ¿Eran personas que pensaban, conscientes? ¿Cómo entonces tomar el relato de Génesis según Craig?
I think that Adam and Eve were real people, and that they were the founding couple from whom the entire human race has descended. So I defend the historicity of this founding couple of the human race. And I try to show as well that this is entirely compatible with what modern paleoanthropology tells us about the origin of humanity on this planet. Now, your question was about the narrative of the fall, and I think that there we do have what I talked about, namely a real event that occurred, namely a fall into sin by our founding parents, but that this is described in figurative language that shouldn't be pressed for literality. I don't think that there were these magical trees whose fruit, if eaten, would convey the knowledge of good and evil, or would impart immortality. I don't see any reason to think that there was a talking snake in the garden, and that the reason snakes crawl on the ground is because God cursed the snake. It seems to me there that the snake is a sort of symbol of evil and sin, leading them away from God. So while I take the narrative to concern real people and a real event, I think that it's just filled with figurative language. And this becomes most obvious, just blindingly obvious, in chapter 3, when God is described as a humanoid being walking in the cool of the garden and looking for Adam and Eve, who are hiding from him in the bushes. And God's asking, where are you? And they're trying to hide themselves from God. This is an anthropomorphic description of God that cannot be taken literally, because we know that the author of Genesis believes that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that he is a transcendent being beyond matter, beyond energy, beyond space, who brought all of this into existence, and therefore he is not a corporeal humanoid being such as is described in Genesis 2 and 3. So it seems to me just undeniable that what we have here are narratives that are filled with figurative language.
Lo que me he preguntado sobre la postura del Dr. Craig específicamente es esa diferencia que hay entre el lenguaje figurativo y los eventos reales, porque como escuchamos para el Dr. Craig, la caída, Adán y Eva, es un evento real, son personas reales, pero el lenguaje en Génesis 3, de Génesis 1 al 11, es figurativo y mítico. Entonces estos elementos como los árboles, la serpiente hablando, son elementos figurativos o parte de este lenguaje mítico. Y mi pregunta es, ¿cómo eso afecta a la predicación o a los pastores cuando comparten de estos textos a la iglesia? ¿Y cómo afecta eso la transmisión de doctrina teológica o de mensajes prácticos en los domingos, en el culto dominical, a la iglesia, ¿no? ¿Cuál sería la perspectiva del Dr. Craig respecto a esto?
Buenísima pregunta, brother.
I've wondered that myself, Raul. I'm a philosopher and theologian, and your question is a pastoral question about how to communicate this material from the pulpit. And I don't claim to have answers to those kinds of practical questions. But here's something that might help. In the English-speaking world, Jordan Peterson, who is a psychologist, has plumbed these narratives of Genesis for psychological insights that he says are just shattering and are so powerful. He thinks that they're the result of divine revelation, that these are inspired. But he doesn't take them in a literal way. He's able to find in the stories deep meanings about who we are as human beings and the meaning of life and evil and sin and things of that sort without necessarily taking them literally. So I am confident that non-literal kinds of literature can be exposited and meanings and lessons drawn from it without having to think that there was literally, for example, a talking snake in the garden, or fruit that if you ate it, it would make you immortal. You can explain what the meaning of the story is without making a commitment to all of it being literal.
Yeah, I think it actually keeps you straight on what the point of the story is, because I think we've
my
spent
goodness.
too much time trying to make Genesis say things that it wasn't meant to say in the first place.
Oh, isn't that so true? I mean, from what I've heard people say, Jordan Peterson has brought them insights into the text of the Bible that they had never heard before. And it makes you wonder, well, maybe we've just been focusing on the wrong things, rather than, as you say, what the real point of the story is.
Okay, good, great. A ver, la pregunta estuvo tan buena que se me perdieron por dónde iba. Ok, esta está fuera del guión. Esta no la había mandado. Pero yo sé que me la van a hacer y me van a reclamar. So, la historia de el arca de Noé, literal o simbólica, la torre de Babel, literal o simbólica, me ahorcan si no hago esta pregunta.
See, the real elephant in the room here is the flood story. It's not Adam and Eve, it's the flood, because it is scientifically indefensible to think that within the span of human history, that all of the world's terrestrial life was wiped out in a flood except for that aboard the ark. That is indefensible scientifically, historically, and linguistically. And therefore, so many people try to interpret the flood story as being a description of a local flood. It was just a flood that, say, flooded the Persian Gulf basin or some other local area. But honestly, as I read the flood story, it's very clear that what is described there is a worldwide flood where all of mankind and everything that breathes on earth is wiped out in this flood, except for those aboard the ark. The mountains are covered by the water. The flood story returns the earth to the primordial condition that was described in Genesis 1, verses 2 and following, where you remember the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And then it describes how God commanded the waters to recede and the mountains began to appear. And you have this whole pattern repeated in the flood story. And it's a kind of like a recreation of the world. And so this is, I think, clearly describing a worldwide flood, not a local flood, as uncomfortable as that might make us. And this is one of the narratives that bears resemblance to flood narratives in the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, for example, the Atrahasis epic describes such a worldwide flood. And they have a kind of figure, Utnapishtim, who is the counterpart of Noah in the biblical flood story. And it's a matter of tremendous debate among Old Testament scholars as to what the relationship is between the Jewish flood story and this Sumerian, Mesopotamian flood story. So this is one of the most, I think, compelling cases where we can say that this is mytho-history. There was probably a flood. It was probably local, but it is described in the figurative language of myth as a universal flood that wiped everything out except for those aboard the ark. And I'll tell you, you talk about the spiritual benefits of this. This has helped me tremendously. When I used to hear about Noah and the ark, my blood would run cold because I knew this couldn't be literally true. I once, when we had our little babies, had a diaper changing pad that featured Noah's Ark on the picture, and it had happy blue and pink hippos cavorting in front of the ark, and elephants and giraffes poking their heads out the windows. It was so cute, this cartoon of Noah's Ark. And I would look at that and I would think to myself, is that what we as biblical Christians are committed to? Is that what we think? How can you defend the truth of Christianity if that's what we have to believe? And this understanding now of the flood narrative as mytho-history has so liberated me that now I love the flood story. And I've got a picture, a card of Noah's Ark and the animals in my bathroom where I look at it. And now it fills me with warm feelings rather than raising the hair on my neck. So I do think the flood story is probably the premier example of mytho-history in Genesis 1 to 11.
Give me a second, Raúl. Voy a ponerme en los pies de mi audiencia y para los que escuchan lo que acaba de decir Craig, esto puede ser problemático. Muy rápidamente, Dr. Craig, ¿qué le aconseja a la gente que quizás escucha esto? ¿Por dónde empezar a ver esa forma de abarcar Génesis? ¿Por dónde empezar a estudiar eso? Porque mucha gente dirá, bueno, pero ese que es el doctor Craig que tiene tantos años estudiando, por algo él lo debe decir, es un hombre conservador. ¿Por dónde empezamos a entender el texto como usted lo entiende?
I would recommend John Collins' book, Reading Genesis Well. John Collins is a professor of Old Testament studies and has written this book, Reading Genesis Well, which I think is a wonderful introduction to the opening chapters of Genesis, and characterizing how we should properly read this kind of literature. And Collins takes great inspiration from C.S. Lewis on this.
Oh,
Lewis, as you may know, was a scholar of myth and folk tales and legends. He said he'd studied them all his life. And he recognized in the literature of Genesis 1 to 11 just that kind of literature. And so Collins develops a lot of his insights out of C.S. Lewis's writings on these
good.
narratives.
Antes que nada, también para recordarle a la audiencia que el libro del Dr. Craig ya fue traducido al español. Este es el libro del Dr. Craig, El Adán histórico. Fue traducido casi a la par y publicado casi a la par de la versión en inglés. Si
Good.
alguien quiere empezar por ahí, también puede ser una buena opción. Quería poner al Dr. Craig en una posición un poquito incómoda, regresando al tema del arca de Noé rápidamente, por algo que mencionó, que dijo que científicamente es indefendible sostener que hubo un diluvio universal donde hubo un arca con todos los animales y Noé y su familia, ¿no? Si ha hablado con científicos cristianos y no cristianos para sostener esta posición de que el arca de Noé es científicamente indefendible.
Yes, certainly. I've read the literature and I've talked with young earthers, and they themselves admit that the kind of revisions that they have to embrace of modern science are so radical, it's like they're living in a different universe. Just think, they have to believe that the era of dinosaur extinction took place in the roughly 350 years between the time Noah exited the ark and Abraham was called by God. They believe that Noah must have taken dinosaurs on board the ark with him, and that these were still alive during the 350 years leading up to Abraham. They have to believe that mountain building and plate tectonics were accelerated at super rapid pace in order to explain how these things could have come to exist after the flood just a few thousand years ago. Just over and over and over again, the revisions have to go on. And they just multiply until they become completely untenable and unreal, frankly. So I think that while a literal interpretation of Genesis is hermeneutically possible, that's a defensible position, creation science is bogus. It's hogwash, and we do a disservice to the church to pretend otherwise.
Como ejemplo, lo que mencionó acerca del arca de Noé y lo que mencionó sobre donde cambiaba los pañales de sus hijos y todo esto. Cuando educamos a nuestros hijos en la Biblia y les contamos estas historias, usualmente ellos van a creer o se les ha enseñado a creer en la escuela dominical que estas historias son reales y con los dibujos del arca de Noé y Adán y Eva y todo esto. ¿Cómo entonces poder compartir esta idea de Génesis 1 al 11 y las historias que contiene, que son mito historia, pero explicársela a niños menores de 6, 7 años que usualmente lo van a creer?
Excelente.
Literales, no reales, Raúl. No los metas en más problemas.
Sí, sí, ándale, perdón, que no son, no son literales.
I don't know. I don't know, Raul.
That's
I'm
an
a
honest answer.
philosopher, a theologian, and I honestly don't know. I do know that children love stories that aren't necessarily literal. When I was a boy, I loved Aesop's fables, like the story of the fox and the sour grapes, or the dog and his bone, and other stories that feature talking animals. And it was clear that there was a moral lesson to be learned from all of these stories. And I never thought that that meant that there was really a rational speaking fox or things of that sort. It was clear that these were fables, but they were still meaningful to me. Now, I don't know how to do this with children, with the biblical stories, but I'd be very interested if anybody else has some good insights into how you can tell them these Bible stories without giving them the impression that all of this stuff has to be literal.
I think
Thank you for that
C.S.
honest answer.
Lewis. I think C.S. Lewis talked a little bit about fantasy. Of course, the Bible's not fantasy, but I think the point stands where he said, like, fantasy never cheated me or tricked me. Like, he wouldn't think that the meaning behind the stories was less true because it was a fantastical story.
Yes.
But he was more cheated by true stories that he would read as a teen or as a young kid about how the real world worked, and that when the real world didn't work in the way the story portrayed. As a mom, I would say just teach the story as it is in the Bible, and when the questions come up, just answer the questions
Yes.
as best as you can. Because you don't need to give a class on history to your 6-year-old, but I think he will be smart enough to ask the right questions to get which part is the real meaning of it and which part
Yeah.
is a literary device.
That's very good. And who was it that said that fantasy never betrayed him?
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis. Ah,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
really, really good, isn't it?
Yeah, I love it. And I use it all the time because a lot of people have problems with kids watching even superhero movies or reading fantasy stories because, oh, they're going to learn all the wrong things about how the world works. And C.S. Lewis was like, no, children are smart. They understand how the
Yeah.
world works, and they can set aside truth from
Yeah.
device. So, yeah.
Can you tell me, do you know where C.S. Lewis said that, where that quotation comes from?
I think it was an essay. I'm going to look it up and send it to Raúl so he can get that to you.
Okay, good.
Gray sostiene que había seres humanos hace 750.000 años, como los Homo heidelbergensis. ¿Por qué el desarrollo tecnológico, científico, espiritual y lingüístico parece haber tenido un auge solamente en los últimos 10.000 o 15.000 años?
This has to do with what is called cultural evolution. In addition to biological evolution, there is also cultural evolution, where the innate intelligence of human beings is called forth to develop new technologies and better instruments. And so long as things are working well, the environment often will lag way behind the biological capacities of the human beings in question. And a perfect illustration of this, Raul, is in the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. I don't know if you've ever heard of these. These are islands in the Indian Ocean that are extremely isolated, far out to sea. And it is internationally prohibited by law for anyone to come into contact with the Andaman Islanders because they are still living in the Stone Age. These are literally prehistoric peoples. And if we were to come into contact with them with our modern culture and inventions, the fear is that their society would be utterly destroyed. And so the international community has covenanted together to simply leave them alone. Now, that doesn't mean that they're less intelligent than we are, that they are somehow mentally retarded. It's just that the environment hasn't called forth the technological and cultural advances that we've experienced. They haven't had that kind of cultural evolution. But they are our equivalents in terms of intelligence and innate capacity. We see this, for another example, in the Native American Indians. When the Europeans arrived on the American shores, the Native Americans were still Stone-aged peoples. They hadn't even invented the wheel yet. They were still using Stone Age implements. And yet here are people that came into contact with them that had Newtonian physics and steam engines and who had Bach's concertos and the medieval cathedrals. I mean, the disparity culturally is astonishing. And yet these Native American Indians, though still living in the Stone Age, were every bit the intellectual equals of the colonizers. In fact, one of them, very famous North American Indian named Squanto, went back to England with the colonists, where he entered into service and became the head butler in a great English family. And after many years, then he decided he wanted to return to his own people back in the American colonies. So the native capacity, the innate capacity is there. It just doesn't always get called forth from the environment in cultural evolution. And so there can be these tremendous lags that you describe.
Hay una última pregunta que si no la hago también me ahogo. A ver,
Make
¿cómo
it
la
quick,
hago?
Jonathan, rápido.
It's so hard. Calvinismo, molinismo, arminianismo. Ok. ¿Por dónde empezamos a entender el molinismo? ¿Por dónde? Que se ve tan difícil para nosotros los terrenales.
Wow. Well, honestly, if you can find a Spanish translation of Luis Molina's Concordia on divine foreknowledge, that would be the best thing. He, of course, wrote in Latin, and part of the Concordia has now been translated into English and is available. I don't know that it's available, unfortunately, in Spanish, but there really is no substitute for reading Luis Molina himself. He's very clear and absolutely brilliant. Now, if you do want a secondary source to introduce you to this, I have a little book called The Only Wise God, only about 110 pages long, in which it introduces the problems of divine foreknowledge and human freedom and the subject of middle knowledge, which is Molina's greatest invention. So you could look at that, The Only Wise God.
Ok. Bueno, hermanos, el doctor William Lane Craig, muchas gracias por estar acá. De verdad que nos sentimos muy honrados. Espero que se haya sentido muy cómodo con nosotros y que no sea la última oportunidad. Creo que ese fue un primer contacto con la audiencia en español. Esperamos en un futuro tocar unos temas más específicos y que sea de edificación para la iglesia. Nosotros, I am fan, soy un fan.
He's a fan.
I have my book in Spanish here. So, I'm so glad to have you here, Dr. Craig. Thank you very much. ¿Tú tienes las últimas palabras para la audiencia en Latinoamérica?
Just that the challenges of the 21st century are going to be huge, and the nations of Latin America will be emerging very important as important players geopolitically. And so we need to do all we can to see that the kingdom of God is expanded throughout our nations.
Amen. Amen.
Ok.
Thank you so
Bueno,
much. That was so fun.
It was fun, and I enjoyed greatly our conversation today. Thank you.
Bueno, el Dr. Craig ya mencionó La Concordia de Luis de Molina. Esa creo que sí está en español, creo que está en PDF, la pueden buscar en internet. No sé si esté completa o no, para serles muy honesto, pero pueden buscarla. Recursos en español, el Dr. Craig mencionó su libro, The Only Wise God. Ese libro ya está traducido al español, se llama El único sabio Dios, y aquí está si lo quieren ver. Realmente es un, Publicaciones Kerigma es quien lo publicó. Es un muy buen libro. Personalmente, bueno, yo les recomendaría la versión en inglés, pero si no conocen inglés, pues la versión en español ya está disponible para que la consigan y es aquí donde el Dr. Craig presenta argumentos bíblicos y filosóficos para creer que Dios tiene conocimiento medio, que es el distintivo de lo que es el molinismo, que lo separa del arminianismo y el calvinismo, y cómo esto tiene interacción con la soberanía de Dios. Ahora, otro libro que yo recomiendo bastante es la biografía de Luis de Molina. Este está escrito por Kirk McGregor. Este solamente está en inglés, pero es una joya de libro. Kirk hace un excelente trabajo en explicar el pensamiento de Molina, cómo interpretaba Romanos 9, por ejemplo, las diferencias que tiene el pensamiento de Molina con el pensamiento de Arminio, el pensamiento de Calvino, la interacción que Molina tuvo y la respuesta que tuvo Molina con la propia Iglesia Católica, porque la Iglesia Católica inicialmente no aceptó el molinismo como válido y de hecho lo persiguieron, pero el trabajo de Kirk McGregor es fenomenal para entender el pensamiento de Molina, sus argumentos, su interpretación bíblica y cómo es que Molina desarrolló lo que ahora se conoce como el molinismo. Entonces, esos dos libros yo recomendaría. El primero, El único sabio Dios, en español, por William Lane Craig, y el segundo, Luis de Molina, la biografía de Kirk McGregor.